Dutch disease is when you have one extractive, export-driven sector that sucks up all the labor and creates apathy towards economic intensification elsewhere. So you end up with just every industry feeding that one thing, that one industry. All the complementary industries then become reliant on that one industry's success. That industry fails, and then everything else fails. You've developed no additional talent. You've developed no ability to pivot in the economy. That is the South right now, and that's it with cotton.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Buck Starts Here, the podcast that usually digs deep into the juicy stories, power plays, and wild twists that shape the presidencies of the United States. But today, we are smack dab in the middle of Eric's economic dissertation, analyzing the North and South's economic divergences. Last episode, we watched the North and South slowly drift apart economically from the 1770s through the early 1800s, building two very different systems that were still technically part of the same country. Now, as we move into the 1810s and beyond, we're going to start to see some real shocks to the system. War, credit collapses, panics of 1937, and an economy in the South so dependent on one export that when it falls, everything falls with it. So without any further ado, let's jump back over to Eric.
Now, we run in, as we move into the 1810s, we see our first real, what we would define as a recession today. We see the Panic of 1819. So we have the War of 1812.
Tariffs of Abomination coming up too, or is that?
Yeah, dude. Yeah, that's 1820s, man.
1820s.
They get wild.
A little early. My bad.
No, I mean you're in the same same time period.
Within 10 years, I'm feeling good.
You feel good? Yeah. What are you doing, man? You're doing fine.
I learned a little bit.
So you come after the War of 1812 ends, 1814. Disruption, but that's the cool thing about trade. Trade is kind of a great equalizer. Like, people like there used to be this thing like no two countries the McDonald's fight each other. And while that's not 100% accurate, that's kind of wildly accurate. But during the war, we have this interesting effect in the North where you start to see domestic production meant towards domestic consumption start to occur. Now, when we were talking about the example of Chinese production, about how they're not today's Chinese productions, that they're not producing things that the average Chinese person can buy, and that could be a problem in your economy. So that's what was happening in the United States to some degree.
So is that a problem of there's just no, like they don't have the money or the income to be able to afford the goods, or the goods just not even available because they're not even marketing to them because they don't have any?
Yeah, they just don't have enough
to be worth it.
They don't have enough money to compete with the market. In China's case, in the North's case, it was a higher profit margin to send out, while still creating a little bit of enough that your people could still buy stuff. Well, the war obviously stopped that. Embargoes made that difficult. So sometimes people like to describe the Panic of 1819 as this system that, I'm going to be broad here for a second, that like, we need to start producing domestic we need domestic production for domestic consumption. No.
No, it sounds like
a slow process over time. Yeah, it is. I love the Occam's rate. Don't get me wrong, I do love that. But no, there's a beautiful
one buyer
narrative.
went away here, and then it just turned out we had a bunch of people who had money that were actually available and wanted to buy these things too.
Yes,
like it wasn't a master plan.
Yes, because economics is real. Like economics is not. The economy is not sentient. So we have this increased domestic production that occurs because of war-related issues with trade. So as the decade ends with the Panic of 1819, this tightening credit really starts depressing commodity prices, right? Because there's not a supply of easily available credit, which means there's not demand for the goods, which means if you have falling demand and fixed supply, you get lower prices. It's Econ 101. So that starts affecting the commodity prices, right? Now, that really hurts indebted households, and many of those indebted households who accrue debt during the embargo period, this starts weighing hard on farmers during this. Now, what happens when you have depression of farmers, right? You obviously see a reduction in food production, but you also see people who live on farms start moving to the city looking for work. And you can have very interesting labor effects from that. And again, you jumped on it perfectly. We're going in the 1820s next. We are going to the period where ports become exponentially dominant. So one of the beautiful things about capitalistic markets is they do have this self-correcting behavior where even in economic downturns, given, and again, a discussion with capitalistic markets is always how much pain do you want to incur before the upside, right? Right, and that's a discussion separate from here. But it does have this self-correcting nature of producing more available labor. So while this farming issue in the 1810s is certainly farming labor and falling commodity prices certainly hurts farms, it does fertilize the fields of the ports with readily accessible labor. And housing becomes kind of interesting because we're not starting to see housing, people buying houses, obviously, as the artisan class and merchant class rise, people buying houses, but we start seeing, actually, they're not mortgages, but people buying the material to build houses on credit. Obviously, as you have a credit crunch, that creates some weird effects that result in like housing price swings that were pretty violent during this time. But even despite all this panic, we do start seeing industrial employment start popping up in pockets, especially in the textile industries. And we start seeing that for the average household, opportunities increasing. And it really starts depending on that, what I discussed earlier, that farmer labor becoming, is it becoming art? Are they able to make the transition to artisan apprenticeships and stuff like that? But we're seeing, even in the limited environments of the Panic of 1819, we are starting to see what regular stratification, that it's now becoming part of labor now has options. You can choose what to do. You're not kind of tied to your land.
Right. Or a career. If your dad decides at 12 you're going to be a silversmith and you're stuck with that for the rest of your life. Yeah.
The South is going in the opposite direction at this time. Cotton expansion continues. The Panic of 1819, this is one of the funnest ones we ever cut. That whole credit exchange with England, that was one of my favorite episodes we did. Right. Horrific. As bad as the North is with some of that debt knit from the embargo era, the thing is that once the embargo era ended, it was pretty quick to re-engage. The South doesn't have that. There is 1 or 2 crop cycles a year. Oh, wow. There's no scalability. You can't make cotton grow faster. I'm sure there's ways to do that now, but at the time you can. And this creates an issue where indebted planters, especially the smaller operations, contract so brutally that they kind of now just start getting gobbled up. And it really pushes the smaller farmers in the South to a breaking point. And again, if you're not investing in capital, how are you increasing your rates, right? How are you making more money? Well, in the South just
increasing productivity.
Yep, it just keeps trying to plant more cotton. And this also creates a cool thing that Kyle does better than me: asset concentration. They just have cotton; that's their asset.
I was actually wondering, because you mentioned just the fact that farmers in general are taking such a big hit. Did this lead to any food shortages or anything like that? Because you lose all your farmers. It sounds like a recipe for disaster for a developing country.
What we do see, because of the free floating prices, is we don't actually see a constraint on food supply. That is a cool thing with the United States. So we're the biggest agricultural power even to today. We produce so many more calories than concern. So much food. That when you have the higher order, when you start talking about inelastically demanded things like necessary food, we just have the access to it. Americans are already fairly wealthy for a nation, as we're going to become increasingly more and more wealthy. Right. So as we move forward to the 1820s, this is a period that's really defined by what we would consider modern markets exploding. That the idea, I put it this way, 1820s is really the time period where a successful businessman today, or businesswoman, could go back to the 1820s. Actually, I don't know if a businesswoman in the 1820s would work. I just realized that. Yeah. I stepped over my own tongue saying that. So let's say businessman goes back to the 1820s, could probably recreate their business model. And that's what's crazy. So we've had essentially an environment very similar for 200 years.
Wow. Really? Really?
Yeah, because we're going to use the term, my favorite term, market integration. That's one of my favorite terms when we talk about economic development. We start to see visible market integration. We have roads, We have towns growing up, being developed along roads and canals. We have urbanization in those towns. We have a labor market that is wage-oriented, and it's wage-oriented at the margin, so even though most households are still farms, the most common thing is still being a farmer, they'll be until the 1890s. 50% of Americans will be farmers until the 1890s. 2% are today. We produce more calories.
Right.
Thank you, capitalism. But the northern market has a true labor market. We say wage is oriented at the margin. That means people are being paid at the marginal product of labor. In other words, does me hiring you, how much more productive are you? Great, fantastic. You're very productive. You get paid more money. That is huge, because now you start seeing the incentivization of productive labor, which is the polar opposite you have with enslaved people, by the way.
Right.
And so in the North, as you have different towns popping up along canals, you have different different microeconomies that then make you more resilient to different shocks. It adds different layers of production. It's an incredibly powerful tool, and that's why the 1820s is fascinating.
Sounds like to me like you're just talking about infrastructure getting put in.
Yeah, infrastructure is incredibly important. Yeah,
I love infrastructure. Yeah. I'm a huge infrastructure guy.
Infrastructure mixed with a labor market is an incredibly amazing tool to have.
You educate that labor pool, and then boom, you're off to the races.
Yeah. What's even cooler is if we go to these if we start talking about these rural farming northerners, we start seeing tools, like machine tools, like being incredibly common almost in every farmhouse. Stoves, so not modern stoves, but stoves that we'd consider proto-modern. Textiles are widespread even in farmhouses. So what's interesting is that you start seeing farmhouses reflecting goods of manufacturing is just as impressive as the urban areas seeing markets with crops from the farms showing up. But now that trade's going both ways. And
the farmhouses are...
Oh, the farmhouses are fascinating. Now, here's my favorite one in the 1820s, besides obviously labor markets. Cash. We start seeing cash becoming available even in rural farming communities. That the idea of people exchanging money for goods and services in the North is becoming incredibly commonplace, even in the rural fringes. And cash is incredibly efficient. It is so efficient when it comes to trade. When it comes to just the ability to express your time and assets in a exchangeable and understandable
standardized
currency.
way.
So this causes two massive growth paths. One is proportional to northern incomes. Western lands are becoming much cheaper. So people who live in the north can go buy Western land quite easily. Cash is existing. Remember, we're coming up on the Species Act under Jackson in about probably 6 years from what I'm talking about right now. And we start seeing, because we have a market wage, we have a market wage that's margin oriented. Those skills that people are learning, which the clerical work, the craftsmen, and now early factory workers are now getting paid in a manner commensurate with their experience and skill set, which means they now have cash on their hands, and you're seeing market wages because these people can switch jobs. They're not tied to the land. They're not tied to one person. And that way they can move and maximize their income.
So basically quitting your job to go take a higher paying one somewhere.
Yeah. And the Land Act of 1820 is paramount to this because it fixed a minimum price for public land at $1.25 per acre, and it required a cash payment. The people who had cash, who were doing the barter system, were the Northerners. Now, this is going to not shock you at all, Kyle, but when we look at the South, we still see cotton's role as a national export actually kind of reach its peak right here. And it accounted for over half of American exports across this time period.
Ooh, okay. So I have a question here now, just to do with like the dollar. So we've got a very industrial heavy northern sector, right? And then we have a very export heavy focused southern sector or economy. The two of them are going to want differing things when it comes to their currency. So Are we seeing any like, I guess, friction over that? Because exporting is going to want a weaker currency because it allows the
Yeah.
purchasing power of the people buying it to be able to buy more.
We are still seeing enough this is a great question, Kyle. We are still seeing enough exports in the north that we haven't started to come to
Okay.
a monetary policy split. It's there, though.
Mm-hmm.
It's there. Do you know where it is? It's actually domestic. Because when you are paying artisans and clerks and you're paying skilled labor who want to then buy things across the pond, they want a heavier currency. So, well, industry, both, and during this time period when we were talking about the terror, if you remember the tariffs of abomination are occurring in the time period, like you mentioned, one of the weird things that northern commerce and southern commerce agreed on was a weaker currency. But northerners as a whole wanted a stronger currency because they wanted to buy stuff from Europe.
Right.
So excellent question, but it's very weird. You have a domestic populace in one part of the country wanting a stronger currency.
I wouldn't have thought it'd been the populace wanting it. That's very interesting.
I don't know why.
Right?
Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
It's very cool to me. So cotton is still dominant. We're at the peak of this of its popularity, and it will stay up here for a while. But everything's downhill from here. We see incomes for plantation owners reach astronomical portions, but we are now starting to see enterprising Southerners who have managed to cut out commercial opportunities around river and port nodes. Port nodes.
Mm-hmm.
They're small. They're not small, but they're smaller compared to what you see like in the north and the widespread, urbanization or concentration of skill set. But unfortunately, we see limited wage labor markets outside of these small towns and transport corridors. So we're not seeing the wages grow enough to where they start becoming self-sustaining operations. Now, many non-elite Southerners basically said the only way they can, they're ever going to have a chance is if they just strike out on their own and migrate west. But they're doing it in a much different way than the North, where the North has the cash available and has kind of this idea of this exchange system and is purchasing land. In the West, it's more. In the South, it's more homesteading.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
they're not even purchasing the land then? They're basically just going and working it for a set period of time and then taking ownership?
Yeah, so they're following different So they're following different processes. Sometimes there's a good amount of purchases. There's a fair amount of just homesteading because the government wants people to live on the land. I would say it's a less procedural process than what we're seeing in the North, because the North has cash.
Right.
Even the poor guy working at the docks is like, I saved up $10. I can go buy that'd be 6 acres, 7 acres, 8 acres, 8 acres. 8 acres of land. Which is crazy if you think about 8 acres of land is wild.
Right.
So as we enter the 1830s, we're going to hit the Panic of 1837, so the worst economic recession. You could actually argue it's the worst one in U.S. history.
I think you made a good argument of that.
Yeah, it was just so bad. It was like 90% of Southern dock workers were laid off. It was weird.
So every sequential recession since then, or collapse, or panic, or whatever you want to call them, have they all gotten have they all been less worse than the previous one?
Yes, generally we see a trend of less worse. Obviously, the dot-com bubble to the Great Financial Recession wasn't true.
Mm-hmm.
We learn. We're humans. We learn. We tend to not always make the same mistake twice. So obviously the Federal Reserve helps a lot. Our understanding of economics has gotten a lot better. And so we're able to make better decisions. So every recession's different. Recessions usually occur when we don't know something. So every recession, it's a little trickier to have a recession that sneaks up on us.
Right.
That's why stagnation is now the new thing. And the stagnation is a real problem. It's an absolutely real problem. But we tend to see growth or stagnation.
Right.
Recessions are becoming less common. And there's going to be another period of time where some technological advancement happens, there's some capital shift that you can start seeing recessions again. But even like a COVID-driven recession, we had a recession during COVID. It was a horrific recession, but it recovered like that because it was largely exogenous. Endogenous recessions are the scary ones because that means the system's broken. Your car driving off the road is scary. Your engine blowing up is much more confusing. I'm going to use that in class. I like that one.
I like that too.
So the North will see during this time period, pre-1837, Panic of 1837, rapid expansion and urbanism, urban growth. And so the North we start seeing households really transition into two categories. You have household farms that are increasingly producing market crops because cash is becoming so common, exchange is becoming so easy, that farmers there are a group of farmers who no longer feel the need to have to grow what they eat. What happens there? Well, it means the farmer, they're making more
grow
money.
The thing that's most valuable then, right? They're going to grow
And obviously food's very inelastically demanded, so you're going to see food prices increase, but you're going to see income exceed that the food value increase, and everybody's better off. And then you see households that are tied to what we call wage-driven households, and those are your artisan, your laborers, your factory operators, and such. Higher marginal labor, but different categories. Not saying one's better than the other. Sometimes they both need to exist, if we're being honest. But we see something super interesting for the first time. I would argue this is the first time in human history. Somebody could definitely argue that against me. But we start seeing the rise of historic wages for unskilled laborers. So we start seeing, people who aren't artisans, people who aren't farmers, people who are born in urbanized areas who don't have a skill set. The 1830s is the first time we see wages for these individuals not just basically be subsistent wages, enough so you don't starve on the street. That there's such a demand for labor that even unskilled laborers can rent homes, in some cases buy homes, in a lot of cases they have a surplus of food, they have a surplus of fuel to heat their homes, and these wages keep rising.
That's wild. I would have thought I would have been taking a labor union to settle that.
Yeah. Yes, the Herfindahl Index gets weird on that. If you have a lot of different companies and you have a lot of different laborers, if the laborers can interchange between the companies, unions don't carry the same binding wage effect.
If you have the choice.
As
long as you have the choice, then.
Yeah. Now, if you flip that, there's only a few companies and non-diversified labor, then your Herfindahl Index obviously climbs quite dramatically, and suddenly the union's ability to have a binding wage floor, it becomes quite pronounced. So these people are housing costs are starting to go up in urban areas. They're not going up faster than wages. It's just, you start seeing that the people who usually would have the worst lives, people who don't have a skill set, who don't have a trade, and don't have rich parents, are actually living pretty good lives. They're able to live in a nice home. They're able to have. They're not starving. And this is like one of the first times in human history where you can be born without a skill set and without a rich last name, and you can live in a nice warm house and have your stomach full. Like, that's cool. That is really, really cool. We see that in the North. But we also start seeing the first time we start seeing dense urban housing. We start seeing crowded streets. And we do see the rise. We're not in the tenement era. We won't be in there for another 40 years, to be honest with you. But we start seeing the rise of tenant housing in neighborhoods. So you start seeing like poorer neighborhoods and richer neighborhoods. Now, I'll tell you, a poor neighborhood where you still have heat and your stomach's full is better than
way better than somewhere in Siberia or
right. Like almost all Europeans.
Of Paris are way worse.
But the time. What's cool is this housing stock is also very modernized. And you start seeing, obviously, by this time, the middle class is in full swing. The middle class, anywhere else in the world, looks like the wealthy class.
Oh, my gosh, yeah.
And we start seeing amenities in households, even in poorer ones. Now, this is all prior to the Panic of 1837. This does produce unemployment, wage pressures, wage is pushed down. Especially in cities, and workers who were building these new houses or involved in shipping and finance. But with that said, everybody's suffering from the Panic of 1837. But as we know from our show on it, some areas had 90% unemployment. Now, this is still not as bad as what happened in the South. Cotton is king, and
as you mentioned, their diversification failures.
Yeah,
being heavily concentrated in cotton at this point too.
Yes, and at this point, all the U.S. exports, including the ones from the North, 55% of them are cotton. So that means the South is almost exclusively cotton.
Wow.
The Panic of 1837.
Tobacco. When did we stop producing that?
Yeah, that's weird. I know tobacco ended up getting produced in the Caribbean which is why like a lot of the best tobacco, even to the day, comes from like Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Cuba, obviously. So a
You
lot of
can't
tobacco
wear
moved
your
down there.
tobacco leaves, so that's
No, you
probably...
can't. Now, with that said, it's we continue to see high income for planters, but their income gets almost destroyed, as we know. Remember, Nicholas Biddle was like, "We just buy U.S. cotton."
Yeah,
Um,
he had a good plan. It
he had
worked
a
for a
good
little
plan.
bit.
Worked for like anything.
Hey, why we listen to that guy?
Now we do see a dramatic, I'll use that word, dramatic constraint because of the capital exchange, the credit exchange between basically being shut off by England and then central bank rates rising. And because they're not diversified, the South really has no ability to do anything about it. They basically have to wait for everything to
No, they need
stabilize.
capital injection at this point. Everything just grinds to a halt when you stop buying everything, right?
Yeah, exactly. And outside of Charleston, New Orleans, and those, what we think of like kind of the modern southern cities, we still see incredibly sparse, arrangement of farms. Very, very, very limited in scale, density, rental markets. There's not really a place for people to move who maybe want to be laborers. And the density of commercial services is just not really there.
It's almost like a different country.
It is very much a different country economically. And there's really no way for lower income individuals to I should say, I don't want to say lower income individuals because they're always kind of shafted in this discussion, but smaller farms really have no way to grow.
It's weird because I mean, you have such a high concentration of uber wealthy, and all the wealth is concentrated in such a very small few. Like even the median is very low or depressed compared to, like, say, the median in the north.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of these people end up moving up to the north.
Right. I was wondering if that was because, I mean, that's really your only option at this point, right? Go somewhere, especially if you can go there as an unskilled laborer and actually make a decent living.
Kyle, you hit it right in the head. So that's what ends up happening is that no longer do you have to be an artisan to go live a better life in the north. Right. Now, as we enter the last decade we're discussing, which is the 1840s, because realistically the 1840s we're going to go into the Civil War after this point. So in the north, we start to see that they have now cleanly outpaced and are now the South. They are more productive per capita by a huge margin, even in the southern Atlantic area. So think of like your North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, places that have been inhabited and been productive for just as long as the North, have now pronouncedly fallen behind. Mm-hmm. And you now start to see that even wealthy, super wealthy plantation owners are starting to pale in wealth comparison to artisans and to merchants and to tradesmen.
Oh, wow. That's got to be really interesting.
Yeah. So now there's a lot of that class protectionism. Like, we'll be the top because we say we're the top. We're in the North, and again, there was all classism in the North, don't get me wrong, but it was nothing compared to, like, there's an aristocracy. But this wealth, because the South is essentially boxing out, all this wealth being produced in the North is not flowing to the South. In fact, the only real flow we have is internal credit management and taxation by the government. And there are forms of redistribution of wealth even at this time. I mean, when you're reducing the price per acre per land to below market value, that's a form of subsidization.
I'm sorry, I'm still kind of stuck on that. So the wealthy southern plantation owners are the ones who shut out the northern markets and kept that capital from flowing into their markets.
When you don't allow optimization of land, there's no reason to invest.
Because they're hoarding all the land. Okay, so this all has to do with there not being any available land basically in these places because they've been there for so long they were able to snatch it up.
Yeah, and if you got to think of decision makers. If you're your own individual living in a house in Philly, and you want to go make more money, you make your own decision to go make more money, right? You try and find more work. If you're a southern plantation owner living in a giant, essentially, castle, and you don't interact with anybody, you're not interacting with markets, and you have thousands of enslaved people doing all your work, where's your incentive to be more productive?
Right, exactly.
Right? Where's your incentive to diversify, right? Where you can just say, I don't have as much money because cotton went down, so let me just pay less to the only guy. I'm the only guy who buys corn, so I'm just going to pay less. Because I'm a monopsony. Well, in the South, we start to see some cool indicators start popping up, and one of the ones I always we start looking at is this unskilled labor. Well, after the Panic of 1837 subsides, credit starts flowing again. There's all this pent up demand for housing, pent up demand for everything.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1840s, we start seeing this pent up demand start to be realized, and we start seeing a growth of real wages again. Now, it did stink. There was from 1837 to about the early 1840s.
Took about 7 years, I think we said.
Yeah, about 7 years, but the North recovered much quicker.
Right.
And we start seeing what is often described as higher cash earning potentials. And while rent and purchased food and fuel are rising in urban areas, they're not remotely rising as fast as these cash earning potentials. And when we talk about urbanization, farming is still the predominant, one of the most predominant industries. But when we talk about urbanization, we see two types of housing getting developed. We see middle-class households, and the middle class at this point well outpaces what would be considered the upper class in New England and in New York and New Jersey.
What would a middle-class home look like, roughly? Do you know?
So it's my next thing. Kyle, you're on the same page, dude. They start looking like houses that you can still see in places like Boston, Philly, and New York today. I had friends who had houses growing up whose houses had bricks from like 1846 where they were made.
Right.
And yeah, so they start looking like modern homes, like same layouts, maybe more chimneys than you would expect, maybe bigger windows than you'd expect, maybe different stairways. Think of like ways you design your house to be more efficient heating. But in these homes, this 1840s, have amenities that are on par or exceeding anything you'd see in Europe.
You mean like things like a dedicated kitchen or indoor bathroom, maybe, or
and a lot of people say no, but England had these really nice houses, or France had these. No, I'm talking about the middle class, and the middle class thing isn't really elsewhere.
There is no middle class anywhere else.
Yeah, right. And even the working class obviously had much worse quality housing. And again, we're not in the tenant era, but we are approaching it. But we're still seeing, reliable housing. We are starting to see, and we are seeing consistent food. We're not seeing food shortages in cities. We are seeing people who, are worse off than, say, the middle class, but they're not destitute. And this is where the concept of the Gini coefficient comes in. The ratio which how much households, what percent of income households hold, and you don't want a zero Gini coefficient. Everybody earns everybody has the same amount of money. Regardless of production, or a one where one person has all the money. We are starting to see what modern labor economists call the Lorenz curve. This idea of like at which ratio is income inequality good, because it allows more productive workers to receive more, but isn't so negative towards people who are less productive that they essentially get nothing, because then you lose all the production too.
Right. You need to have some sort of incentivization to excel, but also not so much that you freeze out everybody else from the system.
Bingo. And we see this massive, growth and opportunities in the 1840s into the 1850s of different occupations in the North. You have manufacturing, and we're not talking small factories anymore. We're now talking industrial manufacturing on a scale the world has never seen. It only exists here and in England. You have specialized transportation. You have people delivering things, both intercity and intra-city. You have people who work in shipping. You have people who work in canal maintenance and canal building. You have clerical roles. You have a rising finance class that just is here to make sure business runs efficiency and has skills that are universal and can be moved from company to company, which that's also really good, because if a company fails, it means that labor is not available for the rest of the economy, and it's standardized. I always put it this way: it's like, in war, they say standardized weapons are better, because if one weapon breaks, it can fix multiple other weapons. Labor economics is very similar.
Use the ammo from your enemies.
Yeah, right. But nothing drives and nothing will explain the North's unstoppable economic growth as we head towards the Civil War, as much as the rising educational infrastructure in northern states. The idea of just educating your workforce with a broad education. This is right around the time Horace Mann is doing his stuff in Massachusetts, coming up with standardized education. It'll become the gold standard around the world. And that idea of just educate everybody. Doesn't matter who it's better off for the economy and for the state and for everybody if you just educate everybody.
Why couldn't we do that everywhere? Why is that only the North that embraced that?
I don't know. Part of it's egalitarianism. The other part is just like It's a more advanced thought. It's like, it's the Einstein theory, right? One person come up with one idea that helps everybody. You got, and that marginal value of that one idea is going to be greater than it costs to educate everybody. So you might as well just educate everybody.
Or is it going back to what we talked about earlier and just the urban density, and the density just didn't support the development of infrastructure in the South?
Absolutely. That's a good one too. It's easier to educate people, and it's easier to build a school. If your teacher's only teaching one person because there's so few kids, that's less efficient than your teacher teaching 15 kids. So that you can have more teachers. I'm with you on that. The South is at the opposite end of the spectrum. We see massive wealth concentration all around exports. But we see weaker. All income growth in the United States is just strong during this time period, but it's relatively weaker. In the South, obviously, marginal income growth, when you look at people who are making less money, is higher because of convergence. So you actually see like lower income people making way more money now, which obviously draws young talent from the South to come up north. And especially because this is an export-centric economy. That means it just becomes hyper-dependent on the ability to export cotton, and it does it to the point where there is really no ability to pivot, and this is pure Dutch disease. We are somehow seeing a country that in one area of it is experiencing horrific Dutch disease like we've never seen before. Dutch disease is when you have one extractive, export-driven sector that sucks up all the labor and creates apathy towards economic intensification elsewhere. So you end up with just every industry feeding that one thing, that one industry. All the complement industries then become reliant on that one industry's success. That industry fails, and then everything else fails. You've developed no additional talent. You've developed no ability to pivot in the economy. That is the South right now, and that's it with cotton. And it's reliant on
none of those resources got sent to develop any of the other things that could get you out of that mess.
They're not going to education. They become more reliant and more violent and more willing to sacrifice everything to maintain their horrific system of slavery. And they're doing this because they have no other option. They literally squandered and concentrated the wealth into groups of people who didn't care about development. Capital did not flow to its most efficient means of return. Did it flow perfectly in the North to its most efficient means of return? No. There's greedy people everywhere. But
it did a lot better.
Did a hell of a lot better, because that poor kid who grows up in the tenant house or grows up in, like I said, not really in that area yet, but is working class, but he gets the same education as the middle class kid. That is going to produce better outcomes. That's not a controversial economic thing. That's just going to produce better outcomes. Look at countries that have universal education when it comes to K through 12. And look at countries that don't, and show me one where one's beating the other, because you're just not going to see it. But so the South is the same story over and over again. Its solution to being economically dependent on cotton is to become more economically dependent on cotton.
We need more cotton. Yeah.
As our last major policy that we're going to talk about as we leave the 1840s and 1850s, I know I kind of did them together, is there's the Preemption Act of 1841, which codified a pathway by which settlers could seize or secure, I should say, title to up to 160 acres again, still $1.25 an acre after meeting residency. I know, seizing the right word, secure. After meeting residency and improvement requirements, basically functioning as squatters.
Sounds like another
until they got the formal ownership. And remember, it's $1.25 per acre. That was the price 30 years ago. So $1.25 now is a lot less. And that was the way many young Southerners saw their only way of being able to ever become independent. And it saw a sudden withdrawal of small farmers who moved out there, which was something the plantation class was taking advantage of to provide cheap food for their slaves. You can see how this is Dutch disease. I mean, it really is. It's quite fascinating. As we move past the 1850s, we move into the 1850s, move past 1849, I want to end with what does it look like now? We see urbanization, which started at effectively 0%, well below 0.2% in 1774. We take our first data point. To now in 1850, it being at 15.4%. Much of that is in the North, meaning the North is probably 30 to 40% urbanized by now. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, slave population has grown from 700,000 to 3.2 million. And that's with in 1774, many states that would go on to outlaw slavery over this 70-year period we talk about hadn't even outlawed slavery yet. So we see even further concentration on enslaved individuals in the South. The real thing when you talk about when it comes to income is the divergence. We see the long-run product per capita in the North has blown the South out of the water. That will happen up until the start of the American Revolution, and in many cases still happens today. But it's much more complicated today. We have much more decentralized ways in which capital are expressed, but we are still seeing this higher production. And finally, in terms of housing, we see housing remain relatively unchanged for poor farmers in the South and rich farmers in the South. There's still that type of plantation housing. In the North, we see
a revolution in housing.
Yeah, we see modern urbanized housing. We do see greater housing disparity because it's not just one or two. It's 1 or 0 in the South. There's much more of a gradient.
There's a rental market. There's options.
So yeah, there we are. And as you can see, we have two just completely different economies. We have two different cultures.
Two different countries.
We have two different countries. That's a great way to say it, Kyle.
It really is. And then you started this whole discussion with this this idea of how we as Americans have managed to convince the guy from Seattle that his friend in Miami or the guy in Miami is his countryman, right? Like we are so far from that right now. Like how much longer till we do get to that point? It'll
be mostly depends who you talk to. You have the national reconciliation after the Civil War. I would say World War I.
I was thinking maybe a little sooner, but you probably have a better.
No, I think you have a good argument.
I was thinking like 1895 to like 1900, somewhere in that time frame, maybe would be.
Yeah, I would say you see the McKinley campaign, which was very heavy railroad driven.
Yeah.
I could see the argument there. I think I think there's a strong argument from Gilded Age up until the end of World War One. I read one book a while ago, like a real long time ago, that categorized it like after World War One, people came back and the men who went over there had a shared like humor, but they don't mean humor like haha. They mean humor. I think they mean humor like Greek humor, of like that experience.
Or do they mean it like the four humors?
The four humors, yeah. And that like that created continuity. Some people say it was when you started having integrated military battalions. Or military divisions, sorry.
When they went just like a state. When it wasn't just Kentucky's militia. So really just the intermingling of each other.
Yeah, I doubt it's only one thing that did it. But I think there's a cool, comment below if you have it. It's like, people are like, no, it's the 2010 when memes became popular.
I know, right?
Hey, if you're going to argue for it, I want to hear it.
I know, right? All right. Got anything else that you want to say before we wrap this thing up?
No, just Kyle, thank you for humoring on this.
I can't decide. All right, well, I did not write an outro for this, so thank you everybody for joining us today. If you want to suggest a topic or tell us how we're doing or comment on any of the things that we discussed on here below, please do so. Please thumbs up if you enjoyed this. If you got suggestions for the topics that you want us to cover, you can always shoot us an email, buckstartsherepodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to place thumbs up 7-up on your way out the door. We'll see you all next week. Produced by China Shop Productions.